Recording.
This meeting is being recorded.
Great. So one of the things that I am going to ask is if everybody can just mute so we make sure that there's no feedback on this presentation. And the second thing is I just want to make sure everyone can see my slides. Okay, great. So welcome again today. This is the first part of two sessions on specifically disabilities, equity, and inclusion. Disabilities as it relates to equity and inclusion, and specifically from a faculty perspective. So I am Tara Jo Holmberg, also known as TJ Holmberg. I teach at Northwestern in the sciences, and I'm going to be talking about this idea of disabilities from a couple of different ways, but I just want to make it clear that I am not an accessibility expert in terms of ADA or things like that, but I will give you a little bit of behind the scenes about how I come at this topic in a little while. I also want to give acknowledgement that I am coming to you today from the ancestral lands of the Wappinger Confederacy of Tribes to give a land acknowledgement and to honor those whose lands we have taken on through colonialism. I also want to note that if you need closed captioning today, the live transcript is on, and so you can use that at the same time. All right, so with that, what are we going to be looking at during this session? Well, this first session is really kind of a big picture look at how disabilities correlates with equity and inclusion and what this means for the classroom and for our students. So we're going to look at why this topic, why is it so important to talk about this, both in the classroom and in higher education in general. What does it mean? So when we talk about disabilities, what are we talking about? We're going to look a little bit at the end at the idea of universal design for learning, which is an introduction into the second session happening in 2 weeks, where we're going to go nitty gritty into why UDL or how UDL works. But today I'm going to really focus on why UDL is important and how it is that we can structure classrooms, we can structure learning environments in general to help students with disabilities. So a lot of this comes from really walking the walk and talking versus talking the talk. So many of us, not all, but many of us have heard about terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's usually termed DEI within education circles or within justice circles. It's talked about as DEI. And that's why I wanted to make the clarification that when I say diversity, equity, inclusion, that is not disabilities, equity, inclusion. The D is for diversity. There is also those that just talk about equity and inclusion. And there's a reason why I titled the talk Disabilities, Equity and Inclusion. And I'll talk a little bit about why a little later. And then there's a, I don't want to say new, but maybe a greater wave coming with talking about the addition of justice work with this. So it's not just equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's also bringing in aspects of justice. So how can we right the wrongs of the systems in which we work? And by systems, I'm talking about everything from structures, ways that students are able to access education, way that we structure our courses, way that we structure our lessons and assignments. So how can we make those more justice oriented as well? And I'll get into all of that a little later. So the first thing is I want to do a little pause point. And when I say something like DEI in the classroom, think about what comes to mind for you. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm just going to take a minute here. Okay. In keeping that in mind, think about who or what, in general, we might be leaving out when we're planning and teaching in higher ed. So planning could be all of the different aspects of higher ed, and then teaching in our classrooms and outside of the classroom. So who might be missing? All right. Now, the reason we went through this exercise is all of us come from our own, what we call positionality. So we all come from our own historical backgrounds, we come from our own cultures, we come from our own experiences, and from our own knowledge base. And in education, whether we want to call ourselves teachers, educators, etc., when we design, when we plan, when we teach, we are designing, planning, and teaching from that positionality. Now, some students are also overlapping with a lot of that positionality. And so they, therefore, are included in those teaching experiences. There are many, though, that don't. And so when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, what we want to do is we want to recognize the diversity that exists. We want to offer equitable experiences, not equal experiences, equitable experiences. And we want to include students in the learning experience. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion, so that we can include more of the students that have formerly been excluded in one way or another. Now, this graphic is not meant to show every single learning experience. Sometimes more will be included than others. Sometimes less will be included than others. But the idea is that it's a reframing of what is known and what has been known to be more inclusive. So to talk about the idea of what is diversity and who is either brought in or left out, these are just some of the different things that can be considered from a positionality point of view. So they could be race, religion, ethnic heritage, income, marital status, education, work experience, so on and so forth. And in community colleges, we know that our students tend to be more diverse in any number of these different categories than students of a traditional age going to a four-year university. So we already have, based on many of our experiences, not only our own positionality, but experience with students from other diverse backgrounds. That does not necessarily mean that as a whole for higher ed, that we are being as inclusive as possible. So we're going to come back to this figure in just a little while. But the next thing I want to do is maybe give a visual to help with this idea of inclusivity and justice and that sort of thing. Some of you may have seen a similar figure to this before, where it was individuals trying to watch a baseball game. And that figure has been used a lot, and it's done a lot of good works. But I actually like this one better. This one, first of all, is recognizing diversity from the outset. So you have diversity represented by the three individuals here. The next piece is that they are all being included. So they are all being invited to that space. However, the opportunities for each of these individuals is not equitable in the first one, right? They have equality. They're all given the same size box to be able to see the river. That's equality. But as you can tell, it doesn't work for everybody. Equity is recognizing that some individuals, in order to have the same opportunities, need a bigger box. Justice is saying, well, why don't we just get rid of the fence? Let's take some of those systemic barriers down, and I'll open up access to the river so that everyone can have an equal opportunity, and there's justice breaking down those systems. Some have had trouble with this language. Some have had, there's pushback on this language. And so others have come up with other language. And I'm just going to put this out there because I actually like it even a little bit better. And that's still working with justice, but it's working with dignity and belonging. And I think this comes really into play, especially with this next topic. And I'm not saying at all that it doesn't play a part in anybody else's experiences with being excluded, having isms, whether it's racism, sexism, ageism, classism, all of those things. But a lot of these things are misunderstood or not even seen today when it comes to this topic, and that is disability. So again, I'd like to take a pause point and ask you to think about, what is a disability? And think about what pops into your head. All right, so we're going to go much more into depth into this particular word. But first, I'm going to come back a second to my positionality, so you know why I'm the one giving this talk in this case. So this is me. And if you've ever done a positionality diagram or something like that, it can be really helpful to sit down and kind of think about where you are, where you're coming from, your experiences, etc. And usually the first one that pops into mind for me is educator. For anyone who knows me, this is primarily what I do. I don't have a lot of hobbies. I teach. That's what I do. I also do a lot of facilitation, presentations like this one. I also do a lot of national work with different groups and grants. And so those two are two of my really big pieces. I am a wife. I am a dog mom, for anyone who logged on early, you heard about that. And I am also disabled. So I will say that I was not born with a disability. I have become disabled in the course of my life. And without getting into details, it has greatly affected me and continues to and will affect me for the rest of my life. So I come to disability from two different perspectives, living a non-disabled life and then now living a fully disabled life. I do not speak for all disabled people. I cannot know the experience of all disabled people. What I do, though, is I read a lot, I watch a lot, and I talk a lot to other disability advocates in similar and often different positions than I am, to be able to understand those experiences more and to help others who aren't disabled to understand a life with a disability and what that looks like and feels like and those experiences. The other thing I want to mention is the terminology. So sometimes in workshops or in guidance, you'll hear the idea of person first language. So someone with a disability. So for example, TJ Holmberg has a disability. This is different than disability first language, where I am disabled or TJ Holmberg is disabled. I actually prefer disabled first language. Many kind of subcultures within disability actually prefer disability first, but that's not in general. And so it's often best to actually ask the person that you're talking to who has a disability what they prefer. Do they prefer to use person first language, or do they prefer to have disability first language? So, what is a disability? When we're talking about the US, there is a legal definition. And that definition comes from the Americans with Disability Act, where a person who has a mental or physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And in another section of the ADA, those major life activities are defined. This includes people who have a record of such impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. What that means is if someone, for example, had cancer in the past, they cannot be discriminated against for their past cancer. It also includes individuals who do not have a disability, but are regarded as having a disability. So again, using the cancer example, if someone has cancer and their employer fires them because they're concerned about health insurance costs, even if that person is either in remission or the cancer is not a problem or they are cured of their cancer, they cannot be fired because of something that may happen in the future. The ADA sets two things. The ADA, one, sets guidelines for protections for people, as you see here. And it also sets guidance for systems to avoid problems in regards to protections. So for example, if you're building a house and you're building, if you're building a business and that business is going to be open to the public, you have to have a certain ramp inclination. You have to have a certain door size. All of those certain things are set forth within the parameters of the ADA through building codes so that everyone is included within that. However, this still leaves a lot to be desired, actually, from the perspective of the ADA or from the disability community. It was actually late in terms of civil rights laws. It wasn't passed until the 1990s, so it's very, very recent. There hasn't been a lot of updates to it. And in fact, right now, there are a couple of cases in front of the Supreme Court that are trying to undermine and actually get rid of parts of the ADA, which would make things less accessible for those with disabilities. Now, the WHO, the World Health Organization, actually has two ways of talking about disability. So the first is disability as a personal attribute. And that says that if we're just talking about health, a disability is any restriction or lack of ability to perform an activity in the manner within the range considered normal, quote unquote, for a human being. But that's problematic, and this is recognized with the next one, because normal is defined by some entity that is systemic. So instead, what's actually really helpful is this next one, disability in context. And that says disability is not just a health problem. It's a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between the features of a person's body and the features of society in which he or she lives. In other words, disability is not a personal health condition primarily. It's a mismatch between the ability of a person and society. So society has determined what is normal, what is accessible, what is okay, what will work, and hasn't included a wide swath of the population within its considerations until the ADA put that forward. And even then, there's a lot of pushback on ADA standards because of various issues, whether it be cost or ease or timeliness or those sorts of things. When it comes to, different agencies and circumstances, educational entities may come up with additional standards beyond ADA. So for example, in pre-K-12 systems of education, they have IEPs and 504s, which follow a student throughout that education. When they're done as a senior in high school, those stop. And so when they get to higher ed, now they need to go through an entirely different process and learn that process for accommodations. And the accommodations which happened year after year after year for them is now something that they are independently responsible for and need to follow up on. It's a whole new learning experience for students coming in with disabilities. And one thing that happens not only in education, but in systems across society is a feeling that those with disabilities are somehow gaming the system. We see that with handicapped parking spaces, for example, that those without disabilities kind of monitor those who do park in those spaces and try to determine if it's okay for someone to park in that space or not, even though they don't know anything about that person or their circumstance. And then unfortunately, sometimes we see that within higher ed where faculty or other individuals will push back on accommodations because they don't feel that it's necessary, even if the student has the accommodation, to make it an equitable and inclusive learning experience for them. Corporations may put in their own aspects for ADA, small businesses as well. And I will say there are some ways to be either grandfathered in through ADA or not have to follow all the rules if your business is small enough and if it's not open to the public. And then various government entities will have other rules. So the EEO, Social Security Disability, Department of Motor Vehicles, and Veterans Administration. And just to tie up the end about the kind of gaming the system, very few individuals with a disability have the time, the money, or the energy to game the system. It's extremely expensive, it's extremely time consuming, and it's exhausting to be disabled and work within many of these systems. And I can speak from experience, having gone through a couple of different things in the last couple of years, that it is a fight to get those things which even are allowed for you within the law. So coming back to this figure, what types of things, when we look at this figure for diversity and inclusion and equity, are included? Well, unfortunately, in many of the conversations about DEI, physical characteristics and mental characteristics are often left out of the conversation. And it's one of my kind of points that when I am part of DEI training, that I remind those in doing the training that these concepts need to be brought into DEI as well. That when we're talking about diversity, there's a huge swath of the population with disabilities. And when I say huge swath, I'm not kidding. Up to 20% of the population, this is in 2020, by the way. So 56 million individuals have a disability of one type or another. That means in a class of 24, 25 students, 2 to 3 students have a disability. Many of them are not going to come forward. There's embarrassment. There may be concern about how they're going to be treated. They may not know about the accommodations process. There's all kinds of different things. So in each of our classes, we have students that fit into these categories that we don't even know about. Other types of things that I wanted to put in because they come up a lot is, using a wheelchair. So 90% of disabled people don't use a wheelchair. And actually, there are many individuals who use a wheelchair on occasion or use a mobility device on occasion. And so mobility is an aspect of disability, and not everybody has a mobility disability, where it can be fluctuating from day to day. That on a good day, nothing's used, they can walk just fine. And then other days, they might need a wheelchair or a cane or crutches. And then this one is usually pretty surprising for many, that 70% of all disabilities are invisible. So what does that mean? That means that if you're looking at a person, you would never know that they have a disability unless they told you. There may be tells in other ways, but you wouldn't know by just looking at them. So for example, many with chronic illnesses, those with neural or cognitive disabilities, auditory, vision, or chronic pain. So when we look at 70%, and we're talking about the fact that we've got 2 to 3 in our class, let's say we have 3 in our class, 2 of them you wouldn't know that they have a disability. So in terms of what those disabilities might be, because this is kind of helpful, and this is by no way inclusive of all disabilities, but it does help give kind of a guidance for things that we're talking about, is on the visual side, maybe they're colorblind. And so the use of color in class can be difficult for students. They might have low vision. Some may have low vision and not even know that they're having a struggle. They just suffer with headaches, and various forms of blindness. Hard of hearing and deaf students. At Northwestern, we have had a program for CEDHH for a long time, but there are students who are hard of hearing and again, don't know that they're hard of hearing. I'm going to put cognitive and neural together because they actually are a cognitive / neural, but these would include things like various learning disabilities, autism spectrum, seizures, bipolar, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, and depression. And again, not comprehensive at all, but does give you some idea of what those might look like, not look like, but what those encompass. Speech impediment, unable to speak. So you might have a student who's very quiet in class and doesn't want to talk at all. And there might be a reason for that. Mobility, things like arthritis, quadriplegia, spinal cord injuries, etc. So again, some are visible, many are not. And then also there is an idea of intersectionality. So intersectionality is recognizing that we, as I did with my positionality, we don't fit into just one bucket. And sometimes the tendency is when we're looking at DEI, we're talking about one topic and we don't necessarily realize that people are fitting into multiple buckets. And sometimes those multiple buckets might be many different aspects of marginalized groups. And so when we're looking at intersectionality, it's important to note that many with disabilities also fit into other categories of marginalization, whether it be things like race. And I really recommend, if you want to read further, Alice Wong's work, Disability Visibility. She also actually wrote a memoir, and it's coming out this year. So she actually, her Twitter account, Disvisibility, is great. So her book is called Year of the Tiger, and that's coming out. And then also Christiana Obey-Sumner, and she writes from a number of different perspectives, from a Black perspective, a queer perspective, autistic perspective, and gets really into this idea of ableism, which is the ism that goes with disability. So it is the equivalent to what would be considered racism or sexism or genderism, it's ableism when you're talking about disability, that the normative is for those who without a disability and everybody else is othered if they have a disability. So as we move into the future with this, I want to kind of think about where else we're going as a society. And part of that has to do with COVID, because, it's the elephant in the room. You can't ignore it. And through a bunch of research that I've done, when they've done long-term studies over the last 2 years, 33% of those diagnosed with COVID, whether they had initial symptoms or not, they will experience long COVID symptoms. So 90 or more days after the acute phase, they will continue to experience aspects of COVID infection. So again, they may have been asymptomatic, but they develop other types of disability later, or they may have had serious disease, and that continues on for a long time. Most of these studies, because of time and resources, stopped at 90 days, but they all recognize that it will go on longer. So these include any to all of the following: cognitive, so anxiety, depression, concentration, and memory, to things like fatigue, breathing issues, pain, and abdominal issues. And I'm pointing this out because what we're going to see more of are students with long COVID symptoms coming in, needing accommodations, needing extra work, and it's going to be increasing the number of disabled students on our campuses. And so this is all very prescient and very timely, talking about not only disabilities that already exist, but now because of the pandemic, an increase in the number of disabilities and disabled students that we're going to see. So that brings us to one of the solutions that we have. So obviously we have systemic things to work on. Obviously we have our own positionality and our own frameworks to broaden. And I learn things every single day about disability that I had never really considered before, even living a life of disability now for years. And I will say I've not been public with this until today. So this is kind of a little nerve-wracking to let everybody know. But I also felt it was a good point to be able to connect these pieces of my ability to teach and facilitate, and at the same time advocate a little bit for our students. So universal design for learning is rooted in building an environment that can be used to the greatest extent possible. In other words, this is not just for disabled students, but it is a way to bring in tools and techniques to help disabled students that actually make the learning experience better for all. So, for example, by developing an experience that was built for those who are hard of hearing, so say closed captioning, and by building those things throughout society, especially in noisy environments, not only did it help those who are hard of hearing, but it also might help people who are in a really noisy environment who can hear very well, but just in that circumstance couldn't hear what was being announced, etc. And so reading airport captions while things are being announced all came from technology to help those with hard of hearing. And then teaching a child to read. So we know that having children see words at the same time that they're hearing words can be really helpful. And having a child read to, or a parent read to a child is ideal. Sometimes that's not possible. So pairing that technology that was again used for those with hard of hearing is helping children to read by having the text with the sounds. And I don't know about you, but late at night, when I'm trying not to wake anyone else up, I often watch videos with closed captioning. And it's just really, really, really helpful. And again, it came out of helping someone with a disability, but it's useful for so many. Another one, let's say someone is born or has a disability where they no longer have an arm. And so they are one-armed and they need tools and technology to help them live a life with only one arm. Well, what about if someone has an arm injury? It may be temporary, but that same technology can really help them during their time of healing. And situational. So a new parent carrying around that newborn all the time needs to be able to do things with one arm while also carrying the baby, can still use that same technology. So in most cases, we aren't doing something just for one group, we're doing it for everyone because we can't anticipate the benefits for all, but they are there. So the basics of universal design for learning are one, engagement. So this is for motivating, stimulating interest, and motivating the process. Representation, so representing individuals within the classroom, but also presenting information and content in different ways. And action and expression. So differentiate the ways that students can actually produce their knowledge and express their knowledge for showing that they've learned something. And so here, what I'd like to do is I'd like to share a video. I just want to make sure that my sound is on. Give me 1 second. Share sound. Okay.
Learning is really a lifelong journey, and when students come to post-secondary, they're incredibly diverse. They have a wide range of strengths and weaknesses, and UDL is really about how to make that learning journey tractable for as many of those learners as possible.
I think UDL is important because of the variability that we have across learners. We often think about individuals with disabilities as individuals at the margins, and that if we can develop or create learning environments for those individuals at either end of the bell curve, we go a long way towards addressing the needs of everyone else in between.
We've seen an enormous growth in interest in using UDL, ranging from individual faculty members wanting to use it, to whole departments, to sometimes whole institutions wanting to adopt it as an approach to really better serving the broad range of students that are on campus.
It is not about faculty being the experts or administrators being the experts, but the ethos of we're all in this together.
In a UDL classroom, I felt like I wasn't, feeling bad because, I didn't participate like another student. I was more so looking at myself and trying to be my best learner.
I think this has really made my learning deeper. It's different to me than lecture-based courses where I sort of hear information, think it's really interesting, but then end up forgetting it down the line.
UDL is really critical for helping faculty feel like they can teach all students because it's about designing for all students from the outset.
UDL is really about bringing flexibility and options into the environment by design so that students will have the resources that they need to make learning tractable in post-secondary environments.
So UDL is developed by CAST, which I'll talk much more about in 2 weeks. And I'm going to show a figure here in a second that's really busy. And I don't want anyone to think that they have to read this or look this over or anything like that. It's just to show that there is if I can get it up here, there we go. It's just to show that there's a matrix that, of course, now I've gone too far. There we go. There's a matrix of opportunities for educators when they're planning anything from lessons in the classrooms to planning events on campus, all these types of things to be as inclusive as possible, not only for students with disabilities, but also for students of all backgrounds. And when doing that, you don't have to hit each of these squares. It depends on what's being done, what the targets are, what the goals are. And what we're going to do in part 2 is actually talk much more about, for example, how to do things like sustain effort and persistence, how to provide options for expression and communication, how to talk about comprehension, and what does that look like. So in part 2, specifically, we're going to be looking at how to integrate this model built initially to help with students with disabilities, but then recognize that it helps students from all backgrounds. And specifically target those first three things. So looking at engagement, including interest, persistence, and motivation. Representation, which is also about inclusion, perception, and comprehension. And then expression, which is about action and communication and metacognition for students. And so that's really, next time is really about kind of the nuts and bolts. So how do we take what was talked about here today and this idea of including especially disabled students into our thought processes when we're building these experiences, knowing that it has so many benefits for other students in the end, as we've already seen. So with that, because I want to take some time for questions, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming today. I really, really appreciate it, and open it up at this point for discussion.